Operant conditioning is the other main form of conditioning besides classical conditioning. And the two of them are often confused by students when they're trying to learn how this all works. So I would like you to view at least one and preferably both of the videos that go with the module for this course that talk about the distinctions between classical and operant conditioning. Operant conditioning was really pioneered and developed by a psychologist named B.F. Skinner. Skinner was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is where my parents are from and where I spent my early childhood. So I feel a kind of affinity with Skinner because we both came from the same neck of the woods. And Skinner is the person who designed Skinner boxes, the chambers that you put animals in, and they're usually rats and pigeons. Rats press bars in Skinner boxes, pigeons usually peck at keys. But they're not the only animals that have been used in Skinner boxes. But the Skinner box is the standard tool for studying operant conditioning in the laboratory. If you like conditioning and learning, if you enjoy this chapter in the course and want to do more of it, we have a course called Conditioning and Learning in the Psych department where you actually will get your own real live rat. And part of your grade will depend on how well you train your rat, and you'll get to work with Skinner boxes and see how this works up close and personal. Skinner really pioneered our understanding of the concept of reinforcement. Now, all of you already have a good understanding of how some types of reinforcement work. Positive reinforcement, for example, where a behavior occurs and some sort of rewarding stimulus follows. So positive reinforcement strengthens the behavior. It increases the probability that it will happen again in the future. Whenever you see the term reinforcement, you mean you're strengthening a behavior. And I'll get into the distinction between punishment and negative reinforcement later on. But whenever the term reinforcement is used, it means you're strengthening a behavior. Now, Skinner was not the one who actually discovered operant conditioning, but he's the one that ran with it and really helped uncover all of its secrets about how it works. But an earlier pioneer was a psychologist named E.L. Thorndike, who discovered what he called the law of effect. And his law of effect is that an act may be altered in its strength by its consequences. So behavior occurs, and then whatever happens as a result of that behavior determines whether it becomes stronger or weaker. Thorndike did a lot of his research with cats, and he used to put them in something he called a puzzle box. And there's a fun little video that's a depiction of Thorndike's work with cats and puzzle boxes. You can see it by clicking on the link on this slide, or you could also go to the webpage for the module and click on the link there and see this little recreation of Thorndike's research. One of the key distinctions between classical conditioning and operant conditioning is that in classical conditioning, a stimulus occurs that draws a behavior out of the organism. In operant conditioning, the behavior occurs first, and then some kind of stimulus is delivered, and the delivery of that stimulus then strengthens or weakens the behavior that it follows. So let's describe how the different types of reinforcement work. The one that students never have any trouble with is positive reinforcement, because this is the kind of reinforcement that you're accustomed to thinking of. A desirable behavior occurs, and it's followed by a reward, and the reward strengthens the behavior and makes it more likely to happen again. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, also increases the probability of a behavior and strengthens it. The difference is, in negative reinforcement, you're removing an unpleasant thing. So, for example, let's suppose you get a headache and you take some aspirin, and the headache goes away. Well, the taking of the aspirin has been negatively reinforced by the fact that the headache has been removed. So instead of receiving a reward, you take away a negative, unpleasant, aversive stimulus, but that in and of itself is rewarding. So whenever you see the word reinforcement, you're talking about something that strengthens the behavior. Whenever you see the word punishment, on the other hand, you're designing a situation to eradicate a behavior. Positive punishment is delivering something unpleasant. Negative punishment is taking something away. So if you do something that I don't want and I lay a hot poker on your arm, then I'm delivering a punisher hoping that you're not going to do that again. On the other hand, maybe you were punished by your parents by having a privilege removed. You were grounded, you couldn't go out with your friends, or you couldn't use your computer, or whatever it was. Now you've been punished because something's been taken away. So whenever you're talking about punishment, you're talking about getting rid of a behavior. Whenever you talk about reinforcement, you're talking about strengthening a behavior. The positive and the negative only communicate whether you're delivering something or taking something away. When you're trying to teach a pattern of behavior through the strategic use of reinforcement techniques, you're engaged in something called shaping. The way that you get animals, for example, to do what you want them to do is in a series of baby steps. Nudge the animal in that direction by delivering reinforcement at just the right time. An example that I will sometimes use in my class is based on the picture that you see here. Back in the day when SeaWorld and other places like that were allowed to keep killer whales, they would train them to put on these performances for audiences where they did some pretty dramatic tricks like leaping out of the water over a rope. Well, suppose you've just been hired to be a trainer and you've got a new killer whale that needs to learn this trick, and you have to, through the process of operant conditioning, shape that behavior. Take a moment and think about how you would do this. When I ask the students in my classes about this, they'll come up with different strategies. Some of them will talk about just hanging the rope up there and waiting for the whale to jump over it, and then you'll reward them. Others have some kind of scheme where they'll sort of dangle a fish up there to entice them. But most of the time, their suggestions aren't going to work very well, simply because they've gotten greedy. They're trying to get the whale to do too much too soon. You have to think small and gradually shape the behavior in the direction that you want. So the way you might teach this trick would be to stretch the rope across the bottom of the pool. Just lay it on the floor of the pool. And every time the whale swims over it, it gets a reward. And the whale's going to learn this pretty quickly, and it'll keep swimming over the top of the rope. Well, then you gradually start raising the rope off the bottom of the pool so that sometimes the whale might swim under it, and sometimes it might swim over it. But it only gets rewarded when it swims over it, not when it swims under it. So the whale is going to quickly learn that as well. You keep inching the rope up higher until eventually it's right at the top of the surface of the water. And now there's no way the whale can swim over the top of it. The only way to get over the top is to jump over it, and the whale will learn to do that pretty quickly. And then you start inching it up higher and higher and higher, and that's where you end up with the dramatic behavior that you see here. So when you're shaping rats in Skinner boxes, you have the same issue. You don't want to get greedy. You've got to nudge the rat in that direction, start rewarding him turning toward the bar, start rewarding him for rearing up over the bar. And eventually you'll get the behavior shaped the way you want. Now, the pattern of behavior that you get through operant conditioning depends very much on how reinforcement is delivered. And we call the way you deliver reinforcement the schedule of reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is when you deliver a reinforcer each and every time the behavior occurs. Very few things in life are on a continuous reinforcement schedule. Most of the things are on what we call an intermittent reinforcement schedule, where reward is only delivered some of the time. And this can be done on either an interval or ratio schedule. So on an interval schedule, for example, you only reward a response that occurs after a set period of time has passed since the last rewarded response. So the rat in the Skinner box presses a bar, gets a reward. It might have to wait a whole minute before another reward will be coming after it presses a bar. It doesn't matter how many times it presses the bar in that minute, it has to wait for the whole minute to go by before another reward will happen. Ratio schedules, on the other hand, depend upon the number of responses. So instead of rewarding behavior after a certain period of time has passed, you reward a behavior on a schedule where, let's say, every fifth bar press is rewarded. So the rat presses the bar 4 times, the fifth one gets a reward. On both interval and ratio schedules, you can have the thing fixed, so it's always the same amount of time, or it's always the same number of responses, or it can be a variable interval or a variable ratio schedule where you're changing the frequency of responses that get rewarded. On the quiz for this module, I am certain to ask you some questions, like I'll describe a scenario of some kind and ask you to identify whether it's an interval schedule or a ratio schedule, whether it's continuous or intermittent reinforcement, and so forth. So make sure you study the textbook and look at the videos, make sure you understand that. One of the big differences between continuous and intermittent reinforcement, however, is how quickly they extinguish when you take the reward away. Extinction is what happens when reinforcers are no longer delivered. The behavior kind of peters out and disappears. If a behavior has been shaped on continuous reinforcement, it extinguishes real quickly. For example, think of yourself going to a vending machine to get a snack. Now, yes, I know that vending machines sometimes rip you off. They take your money and they don't give you what you ordered, but most of the time they deliver. And so a vending machine is pretty close to a continuous reinforcement schedule. Well, when you put your money in there and press the button, and if nothing happens, you probably don't keep putting money in there and pressing buttons. Your behavior goes away very quickly. It extinguishes. With intermittent reinforcement, on the other hand, you're accustomed to doing something and not getting rewarded every time. And so it takes much longer for that behavior to go away when reinforcement is withheld. First of all, it takes you longer to notice that the reinforcement isn't being delivered. And secondly, you're accustomed to the fact that reinforcement disappears for a while and then returns, and so you're more likely to persist in the behavior. I've really skimmed over this very superficially, but I do want you to understand the differences between continuous and intermittent reinforcement, and then to understand the different schedules by which intermittent reinforcement can be delivered. There are also a number of operant conditioning terms discussed in the textbook that I'll want you to be familiar with. Discriminative stimulus, extinction, generalization, superstitious behavior. Superstitious behavior is something that happens when a behavior has been accidentally reinforced, but the organism persists in displaying it because they don't know exactly what was being reinforced. Think of all the famous sports superstitions. So let's say you've got a baseball pitcher who goes out and pitches a very good game right after they had something very unusual to eat before the game started. Well, they don't know that the unusual food was the thing that caused a good pitching performance, but they don't want to take the chance and mess things up, so they'll start eating the same food before every game thereafter. Animals exhibit superstitious behavior too. When you're shaping rats in a Skinner box and you're teaching them to press a bar, it's the pressing of the bar that's being rewarded, but some rats lay on their back and pull the bar down. Others leap in the air and throw themselves on top of the bar because this complex set of behaviors are all being reinforced, and the rat doesn't really know that it's just the bar press, and so they keep repeating the whole bunch of them. Chaining, secondary reinforcement. Biological constraints on operant conditioning. There are some things that were programmed to learn more easily than others. And if you're trying to shape an animal's behavior when it contradicts something that they would normally do, you've got some instinctive pattern of behavior, it's going to be harder to operantly condition that behavior because there's kind of a genetic program that's getting in the way. So yes, I want you to go through the chapter and become familiar with these different terms that are associated with how operant conditioning works.